Well, we couldn't have the entire panel join on the scheduled call, but we have our distinguished professor, Anton House, who's full of volume and knowledge when it comes to African studies, African-American studies, African history. So I'm very grateful to at least have him here to further dissect, at least to a certain degree, of the previous recording I did on Africa before colonization. Welcome, Professor Dr. Anton House.
Thank you for having me. As always,
my pleasure. Now, other than the few things that I mentioned in the first video, how nation states in Africa and empires kind of form from tribal bloodlines, languages, religion, and so forth, what were some other key factors that helped determine these nation states and empires in Africa before colonization?
Well, we're looking at resources, we're looking at terrain, we're looking at those individuals who have access to the herds of cattle. Mm-hmm. So if it wasn't based upon the religious and the blood tie structure, it was those groups that had access to those vast resources, mm-hmm. those groups that were able to build this trans-Saharan trade, and also those individuals that were able to connect out to the West. Mm-hmm. So in the whole relationship of supply and demand, those who were holding various products that were needed on the global scale, those were the groups that were able to centralize their power and become strong nation states.
Mm-hmm. If China can date back their history, 3,000 years, recollected history, documentation dating back to 3,000, how far back can African history before colonization be? How much of it is accounted for, given how much information had gone MIA throughout various decades? Do we know?
I mean,
as an historian, do we know?
It's kind of hard to say. UNESCO has a fantastic 8-volume history of Africa, right? Mm-hmm. But even China, after they looked and researched and talked about their long culture and history, mm-hmm. believed that they originated outside of Africa, mm-hmm. right? But it wasn't until they did modern DNA testing that showed that, hey, your ancestors were sub-Saharan Africans as well. Mm-hmm. So even though they have that long written history, goes back to Africa. And mm-hmm. the thing with African culture, traditional African culture, it's an oratorical culture. So the memory and the names and the places and the events in which an individual is trained to be a griot are, since Africa is a vast continent, mm-hmm. These different individuals who are trained to remember the history of the tribes, by the time mm-hmm. the Europeans come, the Anglo-Saxon culture, the cultures mm-hmm. of Europe, they were more focused on the written word. So mm-hmm. if we look at these different places in contrast, and there are some African groups and countries mm-hmm. and regions that had written word that we probably still have to locate and bring to the mainstream. Yeah. To put an exact date on African civilization and culture, I don't think we can do that. Yeah. Because it's so old. Yeah. You know, the various phases of civilizations and people with unique skills, trades, literature, religious interpretation, and leaving in various phases outside. It's kind of hard to put a date on a lot of these things. It's hard to put a date on a lot of those details of history, but scientists have already claimed and shown evidences that the origin of all human civilization derived from Africa. So that's like the beginning of time, pretty much, you know, but it's the details that we're talking about, right? That's kind of hard to measure. Or what we know of as recorded time. That's the thing. Recorded time, exactly. The thing that we know of as recorded time by the Western perspective. Yeah. You know, because when we look at the understanding and the commodification of information, it's mm-hmm. based upon a Western intellectual paradigm. Right. So we're trying to fit something that's the size of an elephant into a glass. You know, what we know of Africa is more like an elephant, and we're trying to put it into a glass. Yeah. And it's kind of hard to put this whole thing in because it's so diverse. There's so many places. There's so many civilizations that have came and gone, and phases of out migration of Africa that, it's kind of hard to point and put a finger on these things.
Just to interject real quick, it's interesting how you use the elephant as an analogy. Just as a bit off topic, but in one of the safaris I've been on here, if you look closely at the elephant ear, it's really the shape of Africa. So if you pay attention to that. So anyways, that's just a little side piece of information. Scientists and archaeologists state that the history of Africa began with the emergence of the hominoids and dates back 200,000 years ago. In East Africa, Homo sapien remains were found. Africa's written history, however, started with the rise of Egyptian civilization in the 4th millennium BC, and centuries thereafter followed the development of the many diverse societies beyond the Nile Valley. But what are some standout nation states and empires that stand out with you as a historian?
Oh man,
as a professor.
As a professor of African American history, I look at West Africa first because it's the origin and the agency of African Americans. So looking at Igbo land, looking at Ifa land, looking at Yoruba land, looking at those the Dahomians, right, and that whole Western nation state of peoples that were existing prior to European contact. And then when European contact was initiated, how these individuals were forced out of Africa, and a lot of the solutions to the problems they will face in slavery were African-based solutions to European problems, in which they were able to not only preserve some elements of their culture, but create some new things. Mm-hmm. So when you start looking at certain words, especially in African-American culture, like gumbo, and how that, for us, is okra. Mm-hmm. Gumbo's a stew, and in Africa, it's the okra. And seeing that there's this whole linear, the word goober for peanut, and my grandfather being from Mississippi, he would always say, why is you toting your bag like that? And knowing that tote is a West African word for carry. So seeing these connections that take place in these survivals that allow us to trace back to a certain time and region in Africa. But then also looking at East Africa, because it's very antique and important. And hearing the stories of how, they say that life began at the basis of Mount Kilimanjaro, and civilization spread it north. So understanding that within not only the world tradition, but what we know of the three Western religions narrative of Africa, and how we enter into the mainstream narrative of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism through those spaces that are identified on the eastern side of Africa. So it's very important, very interesting. Wow. So some of those nation states and empires you mentioned do have a direct connection to African American history and culture. And as you said, like in our previous video, Dr. Darif mentioned the historical memory, and I think Executive Director Kenneth Ward also touched on the fact that a lot of those historical memory thoughts and stories kind of carried on generations. So it's still a part of African American history, some of those nation states and empires. So are there any other key things other than the few things that you mentioned that stand out with any of them, with any of those nation states of empires with regard to African American culture or history? Well, one of the, we have to also keep in mind when we look at Northern Africa, the Punic Wars and the role that Hannibal the Carthaginian played in the overall expansion of Africans into Europe. So that's another key factor and component, that the Strait of Gibraltar, that landmass that separates northwestern Africa from the bottom of Spain. Gibraltar is named after a North African. and seeing that not only were Africans on the move and moving into these European spaces, that they really didn't discover African people as the textbooks have been censored in believing, that it was an overall push of Africans from the South into Europe.
Yeah.
That fueled this overall slave trade that would happen years later. And as I tell a lot of my students, to understand the overall treatment of Africans during the transatlantic slave trade, you have to look at the overall push of Christian Europe to expel Muslims, to expel Africans, Berbers, and the multicultural people who were under the banner of Islam, who were in Europe, how there was this overall hatred to drive out people of color from Europe and to erase the blight and stain of this multinational racial group of people from what we know.
We're going to get a little bit more into the comparison between the colonization era and the Atlantic slave trade in a minute. But before we get to that question, I'd like to ask you, besides economic reasons that I've learned in history, what were some defining reasons for colonization to even take place? I mean, Africa was in its groove. As I introduced in my previous video, so much trade and business and everything was moving along, their own judicial system, their own tax system. Everything was hunky-dory. And then the Europeans came in, but what were their motives besides economic? Or was the economic reasons the only reason?
Economic reasons. There's a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, right? And it's by this historian named Jared Diamond. There's also a documentary as well. But what Dr. Diamond basically says is that when you look at European culture and traditional Native American and African cultures, that when they established their settlements, they established them based upon longitudinal lines. So the overall emphasis was if there was a plague or something that happened to this village who's a part of the same ethnic group, if they die off, there are other villages spread out where the people will survive. However, Europeans, they created their towns and settlements on a latitudinal line. So therefore, if, like with the Black Plague, when it came to Europe, it spread directly straight across Europe and everyone was sick. Well, while this worked with something as disastrous as the plague, it also worked favorably with the spreading of information. So when you look at the creation of the gun, in which you manufacture iron and you take gunpowder, or what we know of as gunpowder, the elements that come from China, and you put these together and you spread the information, the movable press type that's written about in the development of books and Bible, all these things spread upon a latitudinal line, which allowed Europeans to share this information and technology together. So as they came out of the Dark Ages, they had access to the same technologies and information. They have access to the new innovations in response to sailing and various compasses. They're able to go outside with this overall notion of conquest. Why? They want the land is controlled by the king and the nobles. Therefore, the only way for you to move from beyond a fixed position within your society, the feudal system, is for you to go out and conquer new territories. So for a lot of the Europeans, it was them wanting the access of upper mobility, to go out, to sign a contract with a captain or with some company and sail, conquer, and bring back raid, pillage for the glory of king or queen and country.
The major motive for European colonization over Africa was for long-term economic benefits, as they sought to not only conquest Africa, but to also subdue inland ethnic groups in order to establish complete colonial rule and to exploit vast mineral resources for their own economic gain. In comparison, the Atlantic slave trade of the 15th and 16th centuries, slaves became the major commodity for European trade. So the various European countries that colonized Africa, either had collective reasoning and motive, or some had individual reasoning and motives. I mean, people often talk about the Berlin Conference. You want to
Right.
talk about
The
that
scramble,
briefly?
the scramble of Africa, when European heads got together and decided on which parts of Africa they would colonize, and
Yeah.
how, as an agreement between quote unquote enlightened mind and refined individuals, that they would take their innovations, their information, their culture to the darker peoples and the uncivilized peoples of Africa and rule over them. And by instituting colonization, they will bring them up to the level of humanity. And under religion, save their savage souls. So the whole colonization mission, or the white man's burden, as it was introduced as the burden of the white man to elevate the world up to a level of intellect, was duplicitous. On one part, they're introducing innovation, in which they're going to need a bourgeois class to accept these certain ideas, beliefs, and also to assimilate, and well, not assimilate, well, acculturate into a Western standard. But also this creates a friction between those individuals who are not able to gain access to these levers of power, influence, and access to education. So, like, for instance, when we think about the Congo, on how Mobutu, he was able to become an officer, he was able to move up the ranks, and when Patrice Lumumba is basically saying, hey, we need to expel the colonizer, that the colonizer is the fault for this this unified Congo, and the creation of the oppression that we see, the economic exploitation. They were able to devise a plan in which Mobutu would eventually overthrow and oust Patrice Lumumba. He's assassinated, and the colonial power would rule through him, and he would become a friend of Western interests who want to maintain control in Africa.
Right.
So when looking at colonization, it introduced some Western ideas, it introduced Western technologies, but also at the same time, it came with a price. It came with a lot of disunity and the creation of lifelong conflict between the various ethnic groups and people who are indigenous Africa.
Yeah, I think that was a key weapon that was utilized by the colonizers. For example, in my native country of Somalia, there were about 3 or 4 different colonizers there at the same time. You had the Italians, you had the Brits, you had the French, and earlier at some point there was even the Portuguese there. So tribalism across Africa is mainly for the benefit of people knowing who they are, their backgrounds, their family lineages, just to know. But the colonizers took that wonderful aspect of African culture and created it and pegged people against each other, right?
Yep.
And so this is why the civil war, especially in Somalia, had taken place, because I mean, although there are 5 major tribes, many of them are interconnected. Many of them are family, but somehow the memory and the training, or the how do I say, the brainwashing, mainly of the Italians and the Brits and French in different ways. Djibouti used to be a part of Somalia, although Ethiopians tend to claim it because there's a big tribe called the Afars in Djibouti. But that part of Somalia, Djibouti was a part of Somalia, and the French kind of pulled them away for them to become an independent state. And you now see that happening with Somaliland. They've kind of been independent for a long time on their own, but they're still getting support from the British, the English, who helped control that. So there's still a foothold of the colonizers from the outside, still influencing the inside. So African countries have not yet pulled back. Sorry, go ahead.
There's the individual I wrote my dissertation on, his name was Reverend William Washington Brown. He was a former slave. And he said in 1893 that history tells us that our forefathers was divided in several tribes and several kingdoms. They were divided so numerous that this allowed the European to come in and use us against one another. And they were able to take off with the cheese.
Go ahead.
Okay, so Reverend William Washington Brown, he was a former slave who established the first black bank in 1888. He said in 1893 that history tells us that our forefathers who came from Africa were divided into several little tribes and little kingdoms and little groups that it allowed the white man to come in and play each one against the other.
Mm-hmm.
So even historically, many African Americans who were former slaves knew how disunification worked against them and facilitated their bondage. So in order for us to really get some footing and to advance, there has to be an understanding of the common tie that binds us.
Mm-hmm.
And that will be the only way we'll be able to overcome our adverse position. As I tell all my colleagues, my friends, and people who talk about the problem, basically the Europeans created a sophisticated game of keep away.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still trying to get into the game and grab the ball instead of saying, hey, there's enough of us here to play our own game.
Mm-hmm.
And we can at any time get our own ball and play the same game.
Mm-hmm.
However, I believe it's exclusivity, and being validated through someone else's accolades, historical narrative, or someone else's, I guess, vision of them that a lot of people are deferring to instead of, asserting and practicing self-reliance and self-determination and elevating, because there's enough of us in the world to come together at any time to do something historic and fantastic for the preservation and progress of Africa.
Right, right. Now, would you say that there were pluses along with the minuses that we know of to colonization? Were there any pluses to it?
I would say the introduction of, Western ideas in the forms of government. I mean, because by all intents and purposes, I'm a person who believes in a constitutional republic where individuals are able to vote and have recognition in the government that represents them. There are some instances where a lot of the individuals, the kings who were making trade with Europeans, they also identify with absolute monarchy. So this absolute monarch in Africa had peace agreements and contracts with an absolute monarch in Europe. You supply us with these guns, we'll supply you with these other African ethnic groups as slaves, and whatever you do with them, hey, that's what you do with them. So I believe that the introduction of liberalism and certain ideas for government that allows the people, especially the young people, to have a right to vote, to have access to education, to allow for women to be able to go to school, vote, and go in society unmolested, unaccosted, and be able to advance in the society. So there was some pluses that it allowed for an exchange of ideas as well as the access for people to create a narrative, a conversation, and to build.
And there were also pluses for the Europeans in terms of things that they've learned from African culture and society and history. Which was it? The
it was a two-way. It was a two-way street.
Yeah.
Because you can't say that Pablo Picasso wasn't influenced by the art of Africa, or we can't say the European culinary wasn't influenced by the various cooks, accountants, geniuses that came out of Africa that went into these various European spaces and created innovations. And also, when we think about constitutional republics, especially in the United States, we don't get a we the people without African people, because when the framers wrote we the people, they were talking about white males who were property owning elites. It's not until Africans in the United States started petitioning saying, hey, how are you going to say that you're oppressed by the king when you're oppressing us? And they started petitioning and suing for their freedom. It worked for a little while until they started changing laws against.
I can't remember what you called the very earlier Europeans. when they came to Africa, even before colonization, it was the African culture that taught them even how to, the Moors.
Yeah,
I remember a study of the Moors teaching ancient Europeans how to bathe, how to clean themselves on a daily basis. So there are a lot of cultural aspects that were learned from Africans that were taken back.
In ancient Spain, the Christian church had believed that bathing naked was forbidden. Even after the African Moors, also known as the Berbers, were forced out, Isabella, the Queen of Spain, famously bragged about only bathing twice in her entire life. King Louis XIV of France bragged about the same thing. When the Moors took over Spain, they taught them to bathe daily as a way for good health. Other things taught by the ancient Moors to earlier Europeans like the Vikings included how to preserve spices for decades using storage techniques, and many other things that made their way of life much better. Algebra, still used today, can historically be traced back to the Moors, also known as the Berbers.
Seville and Cardoza in Spain, that's where the Moors established universities. Also with the Moors, by them preserving and the expansive Islamic empire, they were able to bring different spices as well as different plants into Europe. So for many who look at Europe as it is today, it's not what it is without the Moors helping to bring them out of the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
Because the introduction of the Moors and the Islamic occupation of Europe allowed for the Europeans of a later date to have a lot of their ancient texts. When the Moors came into whatever space that they went to, they automatically went in search of books. That's why many of the Enlightenment individuals were reading Aristotle and Plato in Arabic, right? Because the Moors preserved these texts and they went to translate them to English because, you know, a lot of them had lost the knowledge of reading Greek and Latin.
So there was good benefits for both sides, despite the horrible era, as I call it. But many of the European countries now are actually very they're kind of sick with African countries. You know, things are a lot better. Things are a lot better. I mean, African nations have become independent over the years of the 50s and 60s. So things are cool, but sometimes they aren't cool. So it's a matter of the African leaders to be smart and really think about what is the motive here. So if the motive is just for help or to team up, or, you know, are we benefiting as well as you, or are you just benefiting? And to kind of decipher, you know, their political decisions based on that. I wish Professor James Taylor was a part of this discussion, because his experience and his knowledge is on the political history of African Americans as well as Africa, but he can join us another time. So we'll keep this short since it's just the two of us. So Professor Dr. Anton House,
yes, ma'am.
What do you think are the similarities between the colonization era and the Atlantic slave trade? Were they both the same motives? And you spoke earlier about the economic reasoning for it. Or was it slightly different?
Yeah, when you look at colonization, it's about occupation, right? When I think of colonization, I think of more of domestication. That basically you have these individuals who are leaving their homeland, settling and reigning over another group of people in a place that they have in this historic tie to. Right, that they are the inheritors of, and they are the indigenous people of this space. Whereas when we look at the transatlantic slave trade, this was more about outsourcing people and manipulating and using them as a tool. That basically these individuals are disposable, that they become somewhat like inanimate objects to do the bidding and the will of those individuals who own or control them. So at any time, when we look at what took place in Haiti with the French, that they were killing so many Africans, because they had this belief that, hey, we could always go back to Africa and get more. That's why the life expectancy in Haiti was so low, because they kept killing Africans. So for colonization, it seems that there must have been an overall drawn out longer plan for maintaining and controlling this space. Whereas with the transatlantic slave trade, it was more about the quick turnover. How are we going to extract these raw materials from this these vast spaces to refine and develop? And then when our labor force dies out, we can go get some more individuals. But the overall plan is to make sure that this project continues. So
So more or less, it was a short-term fix versus a long-term economic fix.
Yes, that's exactly it.
You were saying? You were in the middle of saying something else.
Yeah, I was like, that's exactly it. You took the words out of my mouth, that for the outsourcing and the colonizing that would take place in the West with the transatlantic slave trade, which does become colonization after they set these spaces up.
Yeah.
You know, Haiti becomes the jewel of the Antilles in which they're producing this sugar.
Yeah.
Jamaica, they're producing the sugar for the European empire. So these spaces eventually become colonized, but the initial transatlantic slave trade was to get a supply of cheap labor so you can maximize the outsource whatever product.
Dr. Anton House, Professor Anton House, we're going to wrap this up quickly. We can speak hours on this topic, even whether just with you or the other panelists that couldn't make it today. So would you like to say one final thing about this topic at hand to anyone else who's interested in any knowledge regarding to that period of time?
I would say I would get the UNESCO 8-volume History of Africa. It's a great place to start. Chancellor Williams' Destruction of Black Civilization is another text that's fantastic about interrupted African history, because Europeans interrupted African history. It did not start with our history did not start with Europeans stepping foot on Africa, but it begins the interruption of African progressive history when the European arrives. So when we look at it from that position, the agency then becomes a matter of us saying that, you know, Africa, the birthplace of civilization, the birthplace of the arts and the culture that the world had benefited from, is a place that we must revere. It's a place that we must make sure that we're working to solve whatever issues, fund whatever institutions that will make sure that there's the preservation of the lives and the society of the people of this great continent.
Yeah.
That it's up to us to make sure that the animals and everything that God entrusted us with are taken care of there. Because overall, Africa is home to civilization and to the human race.
Well, thank you so much for your historical insights, Professor Dr. Anton House. My only guest for today. We'll have you back on another topic. So
thanks for having me.
Very
Look
grateful.
Forward to coming and visiting.
Yeah, can you do my sign off with me? Hakuna Matata.
Hakuna Matata.
All right. Have no worries. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.